Hello, welcome to the third episode of Inside the Lab. I'm Professor Cheryl Dissanayake, the Director of Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre in Melbourne at La Trobe University. And today we are focusing on autism in China. I have with me today Dr. Josephine Barbaro, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre. Welcome, Josie.
Hello.
And also Associate Professor Chunying Wang from Nankai University in Tianjin in China. Welcome, Chunying.
Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Josie.
Lovely to have you with us. Thank you for taking this time to join us virtually in this episode.
It's my pleasure.
So, Chunying, just by way of introduction, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on currently at Nankai University.
Yes, and I'm associate professor in medical school in Nankai University and also director of Center for Behavioral Science in Nankai University. Our Center for Behavioral Science was founded in 2008 when I came back from UK and joined the Nankai University. And our center is mainly focused on autism research. Our current projects including eye tracking studies of autism and early identification, early intervention, and genetic studies. And our early intervention studies was led by a colleague of mine, and the genetic studies was led by another colleague of mine. So our mainly research are on autism.
Thank you. And maybe, Josie, you can tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days.
Sure. So I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre, and my research is on the early identification of autism. So I did my PhD on the social attention and communication study, which we'll talk a little bit about later, and I'm currently running a new version of this study in our maternal child health centres to see how we can actually identify autism in very young children from 12 to 24 months of age.
Thank you. And in fact, this is going to be our topic today, really talking about early identification of ASDs and how we really engage in global knowledge transfer of this information. And in particular, we'll be talking with Chunying about an initiative that was funded by the Australia-China Scientific Research Fund, where we've been to China. We've just completed 2 visits to China. Josie and I attended, first visited with Chunying and her colleagues in March earlier this year, and we've just recently come back from China. And this is, I think, really quite serendipitous because Tianjin is the sister city to Melbourne. So we're working with our sister city. We didn't know this when we began this work, but it makes perfect sense that we have this lovely collaboration with our team, which is headed up by Chunying in China. So I guess, Chunying, let's start today by talking a little bit about the current situation of autism in China. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and I can still remember 5 years ago when I came back to China and talked to people in, for example, Bureau of Health, Bureau of Education in Tianjin, and I told them how important autism is. And the first question they asked me is, do we have autism in Tianjin? And so it is, you can imagine how difficult when I want to get a project or work together with people on autism. But five years later now, and our government began to have a huge project on early identification and early intervention on autism for 8 years. So you can hardly imagine how much have changed in the past 5 years. But even though until now, and children are rarely diagnosed before 5 years old in China generally. And for example, the children in services are generally older and very severely affected. And we know that they already miss the golden opportunity for the early intervention if they start the rehabilitation or intervention from, for example, 6 or 7 years old. And even we have this government project in Tianjin, for example, none of our clinicians have been trained, for example, ADOS or ADIR. And none of the staff in Tianjin who's doing rehabilitation or intervention in Tianjin has got any professional training on even ABA or ESDM. So there's hardly any professional in this field. So we have big challenges now.
Well, there's you, Choning, and you can lead this. And of course, this is what you're doing. But first of all, just some information about Tianjin. Tianjin is China's 4th largest city, where each year 100,000 babies are born in Tianjin. This is in comparison to all of Australia, where we have about 315,000 babies born each year. So it's a very large city, and Josie and I have just recently come back from Tianjin, doing some work there. And before we start to talk about that, Josie, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the social attention and communication surveillance that we're working on.
Sure. So when I started my PhD back in 2005, autism was rarely diagnosed prior to 3 in Australia and in other Western countries as well, in USA and the UK. And so although we knew that there were very early signs of autism, so things like lack of eye contact or less eye contact, not responding to your name, not engaging in pretend play, not pointing things out to show your parents things like that. Even though we knew that these markers existed, there were no screening tools that were effective enough for universal surveillance. And the reason for this was that many screening tools would either identify too many children that didn't actually have autism, or would under-identify children that actually did have autism, so missed these children. And so the purpose of my PhD was to try and use these early markers rather than screening for autism, use it in a way that we can implement it in a developmental surveillance type manner. So the social attention and communication study was about training our maternal and child health nurses in Victoria on the early signs of autism from 12 to 24 months of age. And in fact, we educated nurses on what these signs look like from 8 months of age, but we asked them to refer children to us from 12 months of age that they were concerned about. And so what we found in this study is that the children that were referred to us, the majority of them actually did have autism. So we monitored 20,000 children in our maternal child health system, and 81% of all children that came to see us actually had autism. So 81% of the 110 children had autism. And so these children referred to us from 12 to 24 months of age. So we really could identify children with autism prior to 2, and we could diagnose at 2 years of age and younger. So it was very successful. It was the most successful study of its kind in the world, and now we're taking it around the world. And the current screening tools that we have, besides the SACS, are screening tools like the checklist for autism in toddlers, so that's known as the CHAT, or the modified checklist for autism in toddlers. So the CHAT is when professionals observe the children's behaviour, but the MCHAT is actually a parental questionnaire. And so what we found is that the CHAT actually misses a lot of children with autism at 18 months of age, which is when it's designed to be implemented. And the MCHAT, which is a parental questionnaire, actually over-identifies children without autism. The CHAT 23 is actually the Chinese version of the MCHAT and the CHAT combined. And what this actually does is it has the same sorts of problems. It's a screening tool. It either over-identifies or under-identifies children with autism depending on which section of the screening tool you use.
But putting them together then would double the problems, I
Correct.
suppose.
Yes. So if you're using part 1, then it won't identify enough children, and then you use part 2, then it'll over-identify too many. So it's not optimal to put two tools together that actually both have problems. So the SACS actually overcomes those problems by training our healthcare professionals to identify children with autism, using their professional observations to do so, and have that conversation with parents rather than popping, a screening tool in front of them and saying, here, fill this out. So it's much more didactic in that way. So the SACS is actually something that can be implemented in any healthcare setting in which there's repeated monitoring of children's development, and that's why we felt that it was perfect to implement in Tianjin, where they actually have a healthcare system that's similar to ours in terms of early childhood surveillance.
Thank you. And I guess taking this to Chunying. Chunying, coming over to you, what made you decide to implement the SACS in Tianjin?
And our early identification project started as a request from Tianjin Women's and Children's Health Center to improve the quality of child health care and to detect ASD at a younger age before children enter the nurseries at 3. So we need to find a good and a suitable instrument for them to use, especially for doctors in the community-based hospitals during the general health check, with high sensitivity and specificity, reliable and valid, and also try to avoid or decrease false positive value, which can easily arouse the panic of families, and reliably discriminate the children with autism and the children with other developmental disabilities from typically developing children. And then we reviewed all the available early detection and screening tools. And since there's currently no universally recommended screening program for detecting ASDs, even as you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics calling for the routine screening for signs of ASD in the second year of life. And then we reviewed all the available screening tools or methods, and considering our requirements and comparing the psychometric properties of these screening tools, then we decided to choose, firstly, in our pilot study, we compared the SACS with Chat23, because Chat23 is very commonly used in Chinese population. But as you know, SACS has a much better psychometric properties than Chat23. So in our pilot study, we want to compare these two tools. Yeah.
Thank you. So the pilot study that Chunying's referring to was undertaken again as part of the training we did. We went to Tianjin in March and trained, I think it was 252 medical professionals who are involved in developmental surveillance in Tianjin. And in May, so we trained those professionals in March. Josie and I did that training. And in May, the pilot study started with Chunying and also with Dr. Liu, who works at the Women and Children's Health Center and has really spearheaded this project with us, whereby 10,000 children were screened. About a third of those children were screened at 12 months with the SACS, another third at 18 months, and a third at 24 months. And the pilot also used the Chat23 with these children, and it's actually data collection is still underway. Would you tell us a little bit about the results from that pilot?
Yes, and since our pilot study is still going on, since we need to see the babies for the second time for SACS study, and also we're still doing the Chat23 for the children aged from 18 to 24 months. But based on our data, by the end of October, we can see that, for example, our Chat23 study, there's a very high referral rate on Part A, which is original MChat. And the reasons for that maybe relied on the parents rather than a skilled professional, for example. And also very low numbers falling Part B, which is original chat, were also found. and which is the contrast with SACS. Our SACS study, for example, we have found the referral rate for the SACS study is about 1% of the children, and we're still following on the assessment and diagnosis for those referred children.
So that's great news for us, really, Josie, that in Tianjin, the SACS is being implemented pretty much as it was implemented here.
Yeah, that's right.
And
it's basically mimicking those of the results of the original study, where 1% of the sample was also referred. And that's important because we know that about 1% of the population is affected with an autism spectrum disorder. So we want to be looking at around about 1% referral rates, with making sure that obviously most of the children that come in do actually have autism. So it's really great to see, and especially with the amount of children that that are in China, we can really conduct some great research over there, because just the sheer enormity of the amount of children that we can monitor and the amount of people that we can help, and the research that we can conduct over there is amazing, really.
Yeah, it's a fantastic collaboration, and having women and children's health really working so closely with us, I think you'd agree, Choning, is just makes this very easy in some ways, although I know it's not very easy. I was telling some of my colleagues over here about the room full of the brown paper bags, the data from 10,000 children that had to be hand entered into into a computer. Now that will change, won't it? Just going back a little bit, Tianjin has decided to write SACS into their 8-year plan. And so, as Choning mentioned earlier, the SACS will be implemented across all of Tianjin from next year. And when we returned there just recently, Josie and I trained many more professionals with Choning doing the translation. So now we have over 600 medical professionals trained on early identification using the SACS. So I guess, Choning, would you like to say something about how that implementation will go? I know we won't be working with paper and pencil anymore. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. And our next step from next year will be a whole population developmental surveillance using SACS in all the 18 districts of Tianjin, including the urban districts, suburb districts, and rural districts. Actually, now, today, I want to share with you a good news. After your training, just 2 days after you gave the training for our suburb, for our clinicians from the suburb area, and there's one child identified at risk of autism and came to the city level women and child health center, and then he was a confirmed diagnosis of autism. So Dr. Liu, our collaborator, would ask me to thank you for because we're very grateful for your generosity of sharing SACS, this very good instrument, with us, and training our professionals here. And because we found the SACS have a much better accuracy than other screening tools we're using. So firstly, I want to thank you. Secondly, I will tell you, from next year on, every year there will be around at least 80,000 children screened by our doctors every year using SACS. So, and this government project start from this year and will finish in 2020. That means from next year on until 2020, we will have at least 560,000 children in our database using SACS.
Well, I hope that data doesn't have to be put in by hand.
Oh, no, we'll be back in computer.
That's good to hear. But I guess one of the concerns I have, and this is not just in China, but I guess really wherever we work outside of English-speaking countries, it's important to say that from the research in autism takes place on 10% of the world's population. Yeah. And so we really know very little about how autism affects the rest of the world. in talking about that, the next step, of course, once we identify, is going on to diagnose children with autism. And again, many of the instruments we use are used in English. So what happens with that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
For the diagnosis. Yes, and actually, diagnosis is a challenges currently we are facing, because none of our clinicians in Tianjin has been trained for either ADOS or ADIR. They're still using, for example, CCMD or DSM-4. So as you all know, DSM-4 does not have good accuracy on diagnosis autism. So this is a big challenge we're facing. So we hope to have a workshop for our clinicians to train them to use ADIR and ADOS to improve the accuracy of the diagnosis of autism.
And have those tools been translated now into Chinese?
Yes, but now in Chinese-speaking countries, there's only one or two trainer. So, and she has been very busy training people in different parts of China. And another thing is we also need to have government funding to support this workshop for their training.
Yes, funding is always the issue, I think, in whatever we do. Josie, I'd like to invite you to comment here. I know when we were in China, you were invited to look at a number of children who'd already been screened through the SACS and then identified as at risk or not, and you were asked to come in there and work with those children. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so there were, as you said, there were a number of children that were already identified by the SACS in China and were diagnosed by the healthcare professionals, some of which were at Tianjin Women and Children's Centre. However, the parents really had a difficult time accepting this, and they felt that their child was fine and really that there was nothing wrong. And so I was invited to observe and assess these children to confirm whether or not they did in fact have autism. And so I felt that there were a few barriers, obviously, when you have to translate between the languages, and that can be difficult. But I found, overall autism, regardless of which cultural background you're working with, looks the same. And so these children looked just like the children that I see here. They all had autism. Some of them were very affected, others were only mildly affected. However, they all had autism, and the healthcare professionals were actually diagnosing correctly, which is fantastic. But I still felt that there was a little bit of resistance still with the families in accepting, the diagnosis of autism. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that autism really wasn't recognised in China as an official disorder.
As Chonine said when she went back 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. 2006, I think it was. And so if you don't have a history of knowing about what autism is, if you're a parent, you have a child, and you're not informed about what autism is, it's only just become an official, a disorder in China, then it's difficult to understand what exactly is different about my child. My child walks, they can, some of them do obviously use language, they don't look any different to other children, but in terms of these social communication areas, obviously they're looking very different.
Do you think that's exacerbated by the fact that the majority of families only have one child, so they're not exposed to as many children?
Yeah, and that actually came up quite a bit in my discussions with the parents. So we had a translator there, and I was having a discussion with the parents, feeding back the diagnosis and our findings and why we felt the child had autism. And a lot of them would say that they didn't know what was different about their child because they didn't have another child to compare it with. Obviously, with the history of the one-child policy in China, most families only have one child, and so they don't have another sibling or another child to compare to. And so also what they also mentioned to me was that a lot of the time they don't often take their children out to the park, for example, to play because of the issues with pollution in certain cities in China. And so they didn't often see them compared to other children running around in the park. So a lot of parents actually don't have a lot of opportunity in which to see what other children look like, and to notice when there actually are differences. So that not only do we need to train healthcare professionals on what autism looks like, but parents as well, so that they're informed and they can raise issues with their healthcare professional.
So is that work that you feel you can do, Chongning, in raising general awareness with parents in China?
Yeah, I just want to add something to what Josie said. I totally agree what Josie said about for example, the cultural difference and one-child policy influence, blah blah. And this morning, I just received a phone call from a mother, and her son is 29 months old, and actually 2 months earlier, and she found her child has some problems. And she was alert, and then she didn't go to the hospital, and she just thought, maybe I should send my boy to the kindergarten earlier. And then after 2 months, the teacher in the kindergarten reminded the mother that your child must have some problem. You should take him to the hospital. And then he realized it might be a problem, and then he took the boy to the children's hospital, and the boy was identified with autism. And then he talked to me. When he was talking to me, he said, "Oh, my child has language, and it is not like autism." And she thought children with autism have no language, have no social interaction, have no eye contact. So she tried to convince me that my boy has language, my boy has social interaction, and my boy does play with others. But you know how he play with others? She described to me, when she want to show interest on others, when he wants to show the interest to other boys or other children, he just touch others or hug others. I told her, this is not typical.
Yeah, it's inappropriate interactions. Yeah. That's atypical. Yeah.
And the boy has some language only when he requested. Yes, only when he wants something, he would say this or that.
That's right. Yeah.
He has no proper language. Actually, this is not typical language he should have at his age. So I realized how important the public awareness is, to just let the parents know. Autism is not like children have no language, have no social interaction. It's not like that. Lots of the children with autism have atypical development from the typically developed children. And I agree with you what you said about one-child policy, because most of the children are from one-child family. So it's not possible for the parents to compare this child with other children. Only when they are playing, or only when the children enter the nurseries or kindergartens, and they realize, or they can be reminded by the teachers that, oh, your child is different. But it's already too late. I told her, it's already too late. You should be alert much earlier.
And that's why, Cheryl, I feel, Chongying, I agree absolutely with you. Exactly the same here in Australia. It really is about parental education as much as it is healthcare professionals, because that's why our screening tools actually don't work. If it's based on parental responses, but parents are not exactly aware of what it is they're supposed to be looking for or why pointing is important, then they're not going to be answering correctly, but that's not their fault. It's because they don't have that knowledge. And so you can't expect to have a screening tool that's going to accurately identify children with autism if if the responses are based on knowledge that parents don't necessarily have. So absolutely, Chongying, I agree with you.
And we know the literature tells us that 50% of families suspect something was wrong with their child before 12 months, but that means 50% don't realize that, and that, I guess, that charts the work we have to do here and certainly in China. The next conversation I just want to move to is, so we've talked about early identification and diagnosis, and well, there's early intervention. So there is another cliff face, really, because again, there's a lot of work to do around. When we visited the rehabilitation centers, Chongning, with you on our first mission to China, Josie and I were commenting on how old the children were. They were much older and much more severely affected. So what are the moves, afoot for early intervention in China?
Well, for the early intervention, I have to say this is another challenge for us. And because, as I mentioned earlier, there's because just for your information, most of the rehabilitation centers in China are private and organized or established by parents. And only when they found their child affected by autism, so the child has nowhere to go, and then they open this center for children, similar children, to stay together. So they originally they lacked the basic knowledge about autism, and they received no training or education on the intervention. They have some experience, but only experience living together with autism, children with autism, but not a successful early intervention for those children. So for and also for our government project this time on the early intervention, I think we need urgently is training for on the staff and the professionals or all the workers or the management team in the rehabilitation section. Yeah, generally the training for them, because and when you ask them the staff in the rehabilitation center what kind of methods or strategies you're using, they all reply, oh, we use ABA, we use blah blah. But when they ask what kind of ABA you are using, they have no idea. And lots of parents told me that when they are having in fact just visiting all this rehabilitation center and to try to choose which one will be good for their child, and they ask the manager of the rehabilitation center, and they all can tell you, oh, we're using this, we're using the other methods, blah blah. But when they are observe how the teachers are providing the intervention, they found no, they're not using. They're not as good as they talked actually. So I think that is because they haven't received proper training on the early intervention. So we need urgently is professional training on the early intervention.
Well, I know that Professor Sally Rogers was in Shanghai recently with us when we were at the conference at Fudan University Children's Hospital and that Autism Speaks hosted. She trained two groups, she and her colleague trained two groups on the Early Start Denver model. But it does strike me that there needs to be, the task is so huge, training two groups in Shanghai. Can you imagine all the people that need to be trained to be able to provide services for all of these children who will be diagnosed with autism? And it makes me think about a recent paper by Laurie Wismara and her team from the Mind Institute that has just come out. It's just been published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders on a telehealth approach to intervention, again using the Early Start Denver model as the intervention approach, but the way the model, I think it's called something like ESDM to go, and it's about using online approaches to train parents to work with their child with autism via online resources. And I really like that idea, given that in Australia we have many areas which are remote and very remote. It's a way of getting intervention to families who live out in these areas where they don't have access to large cities and trained professionals. Will an approach like that work in China?
Yeah, I think so. I really like the idea to have this telehouse or whatever, and because I found that, for example, the parents of the current parents of children with autism, most of them are highly educated. They received at least a college degree, and they can read papers or books in English, and they can understand some of the English movies. So I think it could work. And lots of parents ask me, since there's no good intervention strategies in China, and they ask me to recommend some of the books or videos in English, and they can learn, and they love to learn, and also they love to share with all the other parents and in the communities as well. I think, yeah, I think this is really a good idea to, because especially in China, for example, as you mentioned, we have a big population, and after this year's pilot study, there are already like more and more parents came to us that can you give me some ideas or information about the early intervention. And from next year on, I assume there will be the people will be doubled at least. So we need urgently the information about how to spread knowledge easily in the community for the parents. Yeah.
And it really shows the need, not just for, you know, Chinese people that know English and can read English, but for those that can't, we need to be able to, you know, get resources and translate and have people that know Chinese and that can translate these documents, that can deliver training in Chinese rather than in English as well. So we do have a long way to go, but I think, you know, baby steps, and the first point of call will be online training, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and having those translated, I agree. The Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre is very committed to global knowledge transfer. And in doing this, of course, in transferring knowledge, we need to translate all the information we have into different languages. In working in China, we're blessed to be working with a colleague who's Oxford trained and, you know, translates all our work, but we don't have those luxuries in all countries. And I think the tasks ahead of us are huge in terms of making sure that we promote evidence-based knowledge into communities, especially into low resource communities that need this information. So, Choning, I want to thank you for joining us today and sort of sharing a little bit of the work we're doing together. I guess just to finish off the session today, can you tell me what are the next steps for you?
For me, next step is firstly is to finish our pilot study, and for the 10,000 people for SACS study, and then I think at the same time I would like to help in, for example, to translate some of the videos and books or papers on the early intervention for our community in China as well. Yeah.
It's a big task ahead of you, but good luck, and we'll be delighted to work alongside with you in achieving that.
Because I think no matter how good our study on early identification, on the genetic studies, on the mechanism of autism, eventually we want to help all those children, help them. Yeah. So I think my ultimate goal is to help them for the early intervention.
Yeah, a laudable goal too. And Josie, what's the next step for you?
So we revised the SACS based on the original data that from the original study, and so we currently have trained maternal child health nurses in Victoria on the SACS revised, and we're going to roll out the SACS across 4 states in Australia as part of the Cooperative Research Centre for Autism, for Living with Autism Spectrum Disorders. So we'll be trying to reach as far as we can across these 4 states and continue to roll out the SACS wherever we go. We've currently rolled out the SACS in Poland, obviously in China, in Bangladesh, in Japan, so as far and wide as we can go so that we can promote the early identification of autism and obviously early diagnosis and intervention, because we know that that maximises children's outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you, Choning. And so with that, this is the close of our session of Inside the Lab, episode 3 on China. Thank you.